Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today we're going to talk about hope. I want to be upfront that this is a word I've been circling warily for years. It's been worn so thin by greeting cards and graduation speeches that it can feel like it means nothing at all, like a soft thing you say to someone when there's nothing useful left to offer. But there's a body of research on hope that is nothing like the greeting card. It's precise. It has a structure. It makes predictions that turn out to be testable, and some of them are surprising, and at least one of them reversed something I had believed for 20 years. And the punchline, if I can give it to you at the top, is this: hope is not a feeling, or rather, it's not only a feeling. In the research, hope is closer to a calculation. It's your nervous system's running estimate of whether action is still worth taking. And a calculation, unlike a mood, is something you can actually work on. So here's our stride. First, what hope actually is and why it is emphatically not the same thing as optimism, a distinction that turns out to matter enormously. Then, how hope fits into everything we've been building on this show because it slots into the predictive brain with an almost audible click. Then, its opposite and the reversal I mentioned, which changed how I understand despair. Then, what happens in the body when hope leaves and what we can measure when it stays. Then, the clinical evidence, including one finding about therapy I keep thinking about. And finally, the limits and what to actually do. Let's take the first step. Start with the distinction that sounds academic and is anything but. Hope is not optimism. We use them interchangeably in ordinary speech, and the research says they're different animals. Optimism is a general expectation that things will turn out well. It's a forecast about the world. Hope, in the way researchers define it, has a specific internal architecture, and it has two parts. The first part is agency, the belief that you can act, that you are a source of motion in your own life rather than only a recipient of what happens. The second part is pathways, the belief that routes exist, that there is a way from here to there, and if the first way is blocked, you can find another. Agency and pathways, the will and the ways. So optimism says it will work out. Hope says I can do something and there is a road. Those are not the same, and the difference is not semantic because they behave differently under pressure. Here's the finding that makes this concrete, and I want you to hold on to it because it comes back later in a way that matters. Researchers tested whether hope or optimism better predicted people's expectations, and they varied one thing: whether the situation felt controllable, and the results split cleanly. When people perceived that they had control over the outcome, hope was the stronger predictor. When control was absent, optimism dominated. Read that again. Hope is specifically the thing that tracks controllable futures. It is not generalized cheerfulness. It's an estimate about your ability to act on this particular situation, which means hope is not really an emotion about the world. It's closer to a belief about your relationship to the world. Now, let me connect this to everything we've been doing on this show because this is the moment where it all locks together. If you've been following along, you know the picture by now. Your brain is a prediction machine. It builds models, it forecasts, and it acts to reduce the gap between what it expects and what arrives. And in the more advanced versions of that framework, the brain doesn't just predict what will happen, it selects policies, meaning courses of action, based on its confidence that a given course of action will actually get it where it wants to go. Researchers call that confidence expected precision. It's the system's estimate of how much it can trust that a plan will pay off. And hope maps onto that with almost embarrassing neatness. Agency is the belief that you can execute the policy. Pathways is the availability of policies to choose from. Together, they are your brain's confidence that action is worth selecting, energizing, and maintaining. So, hope, in this framing, is not a nice feeling that sits on top of your cognition. Hope is a parameter in the machinery that decides whether you get out of bed and try. And once you see it that way, an enormous amount falls into place. Because if hope is the confidence that action is worth taking, then its collapse is not sadness. Its collapse is the system deciding that nothing is worth the energy. Which brings us to the reversal. Most of you have heard of learned helplessness. It's one of the most famous ideas in psychology. The classic story is that when an animal or a person is subjected to something painful they cannot escape, they learn that they're helpless. They learn that nothing they do matters, and then even when escape becomes possible, they don't try. They've learned to give up. I taught myself that story. I believed it for years. And in 2016, the original researchers, 50 years on, went back and looked at what the neuroscience had turned up. And they said essentially that they had it backwards. Here's the correction, and I find it genuinely profound. Passivity is not learned, passivity is the default. When a mammal is subjected to prolonged, intense, aversive experience, shutting down is what the nervous system does automatically. It's baked in at a deep, ancient level. Nobody has to learn it. What is learned when it's learned is the opposite. What's learned is control. The organism that fights back and escapes isn't overcoming a learned helplessness. It's acquiring something. It's learning that action works and that learning appears to depend on a pathway in which the prefrontal cortex reaches down and inhibits the brainstem's default stress response. The researchers explicitly describe that circuit as a candidate neural basis for something like hope, meaning the expectation that future bad events will be controllable. Sit with the implications of that for a moment because they're large. Giving up is not a failure of a person who should have known better. Giving up is the factory setting. It's what a nervous system does when it stops receiving evidence that its actions matter. Hope, on this account, is not the natural human condition that despair corrupts. Hope is the achievement. It is a thing that gets built in a brain out of experiences of effectiveness. It is learned, and it can therefore be unlearned, and it can therefore be relearned. I don't know if that lands for you the way it landed for me, but I have spent a lot of my life being quietly impatient with people who had stopped trying, and this research relocated that entirely. The question stopped being, why did you give up, which assumes giving up requires explanation. The question became, what happened to the evidence that your actions mattered? Nobody has to teach you to sink. Somebody has to teach you to swim. Now let's look at what happens in the body when that confidence drains away, because this is where hope stops being philosophy and becomes physiology. When the nervous system concludes that action is unlikely to pay off, a whole cascade reorganizes, and it's remarkably coherent. Dopamine signaling weakens. And you'll remember from our very first episode that dopamine is not pleasure. It's the system that estimates whether expending your limited energy, attention, and time is worth it. So when the forecast turns bleak, the very system that would have energized you turns itself down. Chronic stress reduces phasic dopamine activity. Aversive learning attenuates dopamine dynamics in ways linked directly to failure to escape. Meanwhile, a small structure called the lateral habenula becomes more active. The habenula is sometimes called an anti-reward center, and its hyperactivity has been linked to disappointment and to depressive states. So it isn't only that the go signal fades, a don't bother signal gets louder, inflammation joins in. Inflammatory signaling can lower dopamine function in the striatum, producing motor slowing and reduced motivation. So, the immune system, which we discussed last episode, is part of this loop too. A body under chronic inflammatory load is a body being told chemically to conserve, and behavior follows exactly as you'd predict. Effort drops, exploration drops, because trying something new is a bet, and the system has lost confidence in bets. Persistence drops as the internal cost benefit calculation tips toward disengagement. Here's what I find remarkable about this: a whole cluster of symptoms that we treat as separate problems, helplessness and low motivation and anhedonia and social withdrawal, may share a single underlying computation. Is action worth it? When that estimate falls low enough, all of those symptoms fall out of it together, not as a mood, as a policy. The organism is conserving resources it has concluded would be wasted. And I want to name what that means gently. If you have been in that place or you're in it now, the flatness and the not caring and the not getting up were never a character defect. They were a system that stopped receiving evidence, doing what systems do when the evidence stops. There's a related idea worth having because it explains why hopelessness is so sticky and why you can't argue someone out of it. Remember the episode on certainty. Your brain updates a belief when the incoming evidence outweighs its existing confidence. Now consider what a hopeless model does to that process. Research on depression describes a state of pessimistic certainty where negative predictions about the future are held with unusual conviction. And a related line of work finds that maladaptive schemas, the deep beliefs installed by hard early experience, actively resist information that disagrees with them, so the low estimate doesn't just sit there passively waiting to be corrected. It defends itself, it reduces exploration, which means less new evidence comes in. It weights the evidence that does arrive as unconvincing, and it keeps a person out of exactly the situations that might have proven it wrong, which is why just look on the bright side fails so completely, and why it isn't merely useless but slightly insulting. You are offering an argument to a system that has stopped counting arguments. The model was not built out of reasoning, and it will not be dismantled by reasoning. It was built out of experience, and experience is what will revise it. So, can we see hope in the body directly? Here, I have to be careful, and I'm going to be because this is exactly where this genre goes wrong. The honest answer is a little and less than the headlines would like. There is one study I keep returning to. Researchers looked at women with ovarian cancer and measured both their hope and their biology. Greater hope was associated with a steeper cortisol slope, which is generally the healthier pattern, and with lower levels of an inflammatory marker, interleukin 6. That's a real finding and it's striking, but the authors themselves are careful to say the data do not establish the underlying mechanisms. So, what it shows is that hope has a biological signature. It does not show that hope caused the biology or how, and most of the physiological story I've been telling you is inferred rather than directly measured. The allostasis and active inference frameworks make hope's biological role plausible and mechanistically specific. But the direct neural evidence on hope itself is genuinely thin. There's some work associating trait hope with structural and connectivity differences in the brain, and it's suggestive rather than conclusive. I'm telling you this because I'd rather you trust me than be impressed by me. The behavioral and clinical evidence for hope is strong. The physiological evidence is a plausible bridge that has not been fully walked. But the clinical evidence, that's where this gets exciting and where I'd want any therapist listening to sit up. Here's the finding I keep turning over. In studies of cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety, hope increases early in treatment, and the change in hope mediates the later improvement in anxiety. Look at the order. Hope rises, and then the anxiety falls, and the rise in hope appears to be part of why the anxiety falls. In exposure based therapy, within person increases in hope predicted lower anxiety at the next treatment interval. The hope came first, and the effects last. Higher hope after treatment predicted better well being 3 years later, even after accounting for how the anxiety and depression themselves had ended up. Now, notice what this is not. Nobody is claiming the therapist made people feel more hopeful, and that alone fixed them. What seems to be happening is more mechanistic and more interesting. Therapy gives a person experiences of effectiveness. They try something and it works. They face a feared thing and survive it. And out of that accumulating evidence, the system revises its estimate that action is worth taking. The hope isn't the mood the treatment produces, it's the learning the treatment produces, and then that learning goes to work on everything else. Which means, if that's right, that hope is not the reward you get for recovering. Hope may be part of the mechanism of recovering. There's a big meta analysis that fits this, looking across 154 studies on trauma. Positive expectancies predicted lower PTSD symptoms, and the effects were stronger for hope and for coping self efficacy than for general optimism. which is exactly what you'd predict from the controllability finding at the start of this episode. What protects people isn't a rosy view of the universe, it's a working belief that they can do something. There's a longitudinal finding worth putting alongside this because it takes hope out of the clinic and into an ordinary life. In a study following 25,000 adults over 14 years, higher hope predicted better health, better work outcomes, and better recovery after life shocks. And separately, in adolescence, lower hope prospectively predicted more depression later on, with the research describing a reciprocal cycle between how a person thinks about the future and how they feel. Reciprocal, meaning it runs in a loop. Bleak forecast, less action, less evidence that action works, bleaker forecast. Round and round, quietly, for years, which is exactly the shape of every mechanism we've studied on this show. The prediction that produces the world that confirms the prediction. And now let me give you the piece I most want you to hear, because I think we get hope badly wrong in one specific way. We treat hope as a private mental achievement, something you summon, alone, in the dark, through force of will. Pull yourself up. Find it inside you. The research doesn't describe it that way at all. Hope turns out to be substantially relational. Parental support predicts later hope in adolescence. There's research on collective hope, on how groups generate it. And there's a model of relational hope built explicitly around shared agency and shared pathways. Meaning, the belief that action is worth taking is often not something you compute by yourself. It's something you compute with people, which makes complete sense once you think about it through the lens of everything we've covered. If hope is a running estimate built from evidence that your actions matter, then who else provides that evidence? Who reflects it back? Who says that worked, or try it this way instead, or I've seen you do harder things than this? Somebody hands you the evidence. And in a life where nobody has been handing you that evidence for a long time, the estimate falls exactly as it should, given the data. So if you are the person in someone's life who keeps showing up, who keeps pointing out the thing that worked, who keeps helping them see one more possible route, you are not offering emotional support in some soft, decorative sense. You are supplying inputs to a calculation. You are, in a real and mechanical way, part of how their hope gets built. Now, the limits. And I want to spend real time here because hope is a word people weaponize, and I refuse to hand anyone ammunition. The first limit is the most important, and it comes straight out of the controllability finding. Hope is not always the right tool. Remember, hope outperforms optimism when a situation is controllable. But there's a striking counterexample in this literature. During the early period of the COVID pandemic, when people were locked down and constrained and had very little power over what was happening, optimism was the more robust predictor of lower distress, not hope. That is not a footnote. That is a warning, because it means that when a person genuinely cannot act, when the situation truly is beyond their control, demanding hope of them is not kindness, it's a category error. You are asking them to run a calculation whose inputs are missing, and then treating their failure to produce a result as a moral failing. Sometimes what a person needs is not agency and pathways. Sometimes what they need is acceptance, or company, or grief, or simply someone willing to sit in the dark with them without demanding they see a light. There is a version of Hope Talk that is really just an instruction to stop making other people uncomfortable with your despair. I want no part of that, and neither does this research. The second limit: hope can be wrong. People show unrealistic optimism, especially about outcomes that are desirable and that feel controllable. Confidence about the future can overshoot the actual control available. So hope is adaptive, not automatically accurate, and there are situations where the healthiest thing is a clear-eyed look at how little control you have. The third limit: hope is not a dedicated organ. There's no hope center. It sits inside a much larger predictive and regulatory architecture, and it is one expression of that architecture rather than a master switch. The research is explicit that hope's goals can even conflict with the body's own regulatory goals. Hope is not sovereign. and the fourth, which is subtle but real. Researchers distinguish hoping from feeling hopeful, and the two don't always travel together. You can be committed to a goal, working the pathways, acting with agency, and feel nothing warm at all. That still counts. It may count more. So, what do we actually do with this? Here's what the structure gives us, and it's more actionable than any pep talk. If hope is agency plus pathways, then hope has two handles, and you can grip either one. Take pathways first, because I think it's the more neglected. Pathways is root generation, it's the flexible capacity to say, if not this way, then that way. And that is a skill, not a temperament. When a person says, there's nothing I can do, very often what's actually happened is that a single route got blocked and the search stopped. The pathway thinking collapsed, and the collapse got reported as a verdict about reality. So the practical move when you're stuck is not to try to feel better, it's to generate one more route, not the perfect one, just one more, and then ask whether there's another after that. Because the system's confidence that action is worth taking is partly a function of how many actions it can even see, then agency. And here I'd point straight back at the learned helplessness reversal because it tells you exactly where agency comes from, not from a decision, from evidence. You believe your actions matter because your actions have, on some occasions, demonstrably mattered, which means agency is built out of completed acts, ideally small ones, that visibly worked. This is why every good therapy and every good coach and every decent parent does the same thing, which is to make the first step small enough to succeed at, because the success is the point. The success is the data, and the data is what the estimate is built from. You don't talk yourself into agency, you accumulate it. And third, remember it's relational. If your estimate has been falling, one of the highest leverage things available to you is another person who will supply evidence you can't currently generate for yourself. That isn't weakness. Given what we now know about how hope is computed, it's just correct sourcing. So let me bring the whole stride home. Hope is not the fluffy thing we've made of it. In this research, hope is the nervous system's running estimate that action is still worth taking, built from agency and from the visible availability of roots. It tracks controllable futures specifically, which is why it isn't the same as optimism, and why demanding it of someone who genuinely cannot act is a cruelty rather than an encouragement. Its collapse is not sadness. Its collapse is a policy of conservation expressed in dopamine and habenula, and inflammation and effort, in which the organism stops spending energy it has concluded will be wasted. And the deepest correction, the one I'll be carrying for a long time, is that hope is not the natural state. Giving up is the default. Hope is the achievement. It's built out of evidence in a brain, by a life, and often by other people. Here's what I hope you carry out of this one, and it's really just this. If your hope is low right now, that is not proof that you are broken, and it is not proof that your future is closed. It is a reading. It's the output of a calculation that was run on the evidence available to you. And if the evidence you've been handed has been poor for long enough, then a low reading is exactly what an intact, healthy, well-functioning system would produce, which means the work isn't to feel differently. The work is to change the evidence. One small completed act, one more possible route than you could see this morning, one person willing to reflect back the things you can no longer see about yourself. The calculation runs continuously. It will take new inputs. It has never stopped waiting for them. That's the stride from despair toward something you can actually use. Thanks for walking it with me. I'm Esther Adams. This has been Strides to Solutions, and I'll see you next time.